This is Lifeworlds, the place where we explore life through other eyes and minds. Let's flip the script and discover how to orient your world around nature. I'm Alexa Permanish. Come join me as we get down and forage for fungi, stalk coyotes, draft laws for rivers, hum with beehives, sing bird language, and help beavers to dam again. Let these stories spark your reconnection to nature's multiverse. Learn how to bring ecosystems back to life, become an agent for other intelligences, and begin to see how you too are the sum of all life worlds. Hello, my dear friends. I think I'm still in that golden window where it's fair game to wish you all a truly delightful and joy-filled new year. May your intentions, dreams, and quiet wishes find their way to fulfillment. And may Life Worlds continue to be a lighthouse for you, hopefully as a beacon of inspiring ideas and worldviews. This new season coming up has some extraordinary guests lined up, visions I am brimming with excitement to share. And as I record this, I am seeing a big brown squirrel outside my window, cheeks stuffed with dried winter leaves. And it's an image that feels a bit like myself, sort of stuffing myself with these ideas and stories and connections of the podcast, and with great excitement of these treasures tucked away for a little creative feast. Last year, we journeyed far and wide together, from conservation photography to Kenya's indigenous seed keepers, plant neurobiology to the soul-stirring poetry of Mary Oliver. We explored Zen Buddhism, immersive experiences of being breathed into a tree, and the millions of sensors mapping Earth's Internet of Animals. From the rise of ecocide law to the mysteries of technology, spirituality, and the living threads that bind them, we wandered into landscapes, both outer and inner. All these are doorways into the divine, into the living, beating heart of planet Earth, and all the ways we are in constant conversation with the natural world. At the heart of this all, I believe, is a simple truth. The way that we frame the world and the mindset we bring is as vital as all the actions we take. And this podcast exists to nurture that frame, to open doorways into a deeper relationality with this wildly alive planet. As we grapple with the challenges of global breakdowns and returning life, both to ecosystems and to ourselves, I really, really do sincerely hope that Life Worlds can be a steady hand, guiding you towards what feels sacred and true. And so, with that, I asked, and you all responded with some incredible questions for this special Q&A episode. And so in the next hour or so, you will be hearing from fellow listeners around the world who inquired on a range of topics ranging from Earth-centered governance, the ethics of de-extinction, alternative economies, language and stories, which life world I would inhabit, that was a tricky one, green tech and the role of individual agency, bringing CEOs into the wild, regenerative business frameworks, and that ever-elusive question, what is the purpose of human beings? As always, I have referenced a lot of books and further readings in the show notes, because that's just what I tend to do. It's too much to pack into an episode. So if you hear something here that brings you down a rabbit hole, be sure to check out the show notes. I'm sure there's something there that can support. So settle in, my dear friends, and let us begin. So Maiken and Emmanuel Gavert from Switzerland asked the following question.
Hi, Alexa. Thank you so much for your inspiring podcast. We have some questions for you that we hope that you would shed some light on. So how do you see organization incorporating Earth-centered consciousness into their decision-making processes effectively? Beyond just surface-facing sustainability efforts, could you share some examples of innovative ways to give nature and non-human species a seat at the table in corporate or community decision-making?
Well, I think there are a plethora of initiatives that are moving to give nature a voice. On the corporate side, we now have nature on the board seat. In 2022, nature actually became a director for the first time on the board of a UK company called Faith in Nature, a British eco-beauty business. And they worked with lawyers in the UK called Lawyers for Nature to create the position. Things worth checking out. I'll put those in the show notes. So you can have nature on the board, and then the Earth Law Center, that's one of the world's leading rights of nature groups, have a fellowship called the Dandelion Fellowship that they call the first ever program for the co-development of nature proxies representing the interests of nature in organizations. And over the next 4 years, they will be bringing cohorts of fellows from around the world to participate in the co-development program to cultivate practices of nature governance, which is quite cool. And then I have also been tracking something called the ZooUps, and they are organizations that want to contribute, as says their website, to ecological regeneration by making the interests of non-human life part of their organizational decision-making. And so what the ZooUps do is they delegate something called a speaker for the living. And these are sort of independent regeneration experts who are tasked with translating the interests of non-human life into operational decisions of the companies. And so these are ways that companies try and anchor ecological regeneration in a robust way into organizations. So school remains a school, hotel remains a hotel, but you're sort of adding a speaker for the living. Then if you look at sort of famous companies, you have Patagonia, and their B Corp model obviously includes environmental considerations into its mission. But what I think is quite cool is this sense of, the earth being the only shareholder, I think really aligns decision-making with ecological priorities. And then obviously there's a lot that's happening in terms of indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge that's being brought into companies with celebrating cycles and rituals and indigenous guardianship programs. So that's kind of on the corporate side. On the community side, and let's say across civil society, I would just say this is all the rights of nature work. We have a whole episode on this from the first season. But as some of you probably know, New Zealand was one of the first countries to grant legal rights to national parks and to rivers, recognizing them as living entities with their own voice. And now governance means that people are tasked with advocating for the land's well-being. So a little bit like the speakers for the living concept. We're also seeing a lot of groups working in communal decision-making process like citizen assemblies, creating sort of multi-species councils where people try and bring in the interests of more than human life into the decision-making process of local communities. I thought it was quite sweet. I came across this thing called the Treaty of Finsbury Park, which is in the UK, and they base this around a series of live-action role-play games, playing from the more than human perspective to encourage like interspecies thinking in local politics, which I thought was quite cool. And so I just really encourage people to try this within your own organization. It can be creative and quirky, but I think it's the process of getting that voice of representation, however imperfect, to have a human representing, that is part of the task ahead.
And that was Emmanuel and Mike in here. We're a couple. So another question, reflecting on the past year, what has been the most transformative moment for you personally? Something that deepened your connection to nature or reshaped your perspective on the work?
Thank you so much for the opportunity for such an end of year, beginning of year reflection. Yeah, I sat here for a while with that one. It was really hard to choose a moment and to highlight something which I think can be a help for others. And so one of the major things that stood out for me was an anecdote from Easter time last year for me. Actually, there were two anecdotes that came to mind. And one was self-guided, and the other one was more part of a formal expedition. So the first one, I went on a water pilgrimage over the equinox. This was part of me wanting to know the watershed that I lived in. I was spending part of the year in Spain last year for work. And so I really wanted to know where the waters came from the house I was living in and the taps. And it was hard to find, like, the head of this watershed. I found, like, old maps online. I started reading, like, government reports of the local watershed town authorities. And they were pointing out all the different aquifers and where the ocean brine was coming in. And eventually I superimposed a bunch of this information on top of itself. And it pointed to one mountain range, sort of northwest from where I was living. And so I went to Google Maps. I went to the street view where not to the street view, the one where you can see where all the rivers are in like more of the cartoony way. Very technical, Alexa. And I sort of pinned the top of where it seemed like all the rivers began. And then I hopped on my bike and I cycled towards this mountain range where it seemed like the water began from, but stopped at all of these little heads of sources on the way, because obviously in some places the watershed starts from multiple little streams. So as I made my way to what I believed was the main one, I would stop at these other little streams and I left offerings, just a little bit of tobacco or some seeds, and just said thank you to the waters. And then I got to that main mountain. I'm not a mountain biker, by the way, so I sort of took the bike in my hands and like pushed it halfway up this mountain because it was too scary for me to like try and make my way up. And I went to the top. It was hard to see where the river may have began. And then I had to carry the bike down the mountain and then followed all of those streams actually to the ocean and left a final offering at the ocean. And what's really special is when I drink now, I imagine that whole journey as it makes its way into my well and into the tap for my shower, for my morning coffee. And there's something about having been to the very top of that mountain, to all the little streams down to the ocean. I can sort of sit and really picture the trajectory the water takes, and it connects me to a landscape and to that landscape specifically in really quite a profound way. The second tale, which I'll share very quickly, brings me into this thought of a topography of prayer. I went on a Buddhist pilgrimage in Nepal late last year, in October, end of October. And we went around the Manaslu mountain, which is called the Spirit Mountain, actually. I have a longer piece, it's about 5 minutes that I wrote on that, but I want to pull out one bit of writing I did. And what really struck me was, as I said, this topography of prayer and how a belief system around reverence and care for all beings is not just in our minds, but is shaping the way that people really physically move through land, interact with the physical environment. And the big question that left me with is, how can we bring this into people's daily environments, especially in the West, where so much of our cities and communal spaces don't speak, I think, to our relationality and our, you could say, responsibility, or at least potential of care for a greater community of life. So in Buddhism, you have the stupas and the chortens, but one could imagine secular, not necessarily needing to be religious, structures in our cities that might guide this. So this is a little bit of an extract from that piece that I wrote when I was there. My internal chatter, rising and falling like the pace of my steps on the rocky soil. My tender heart expanding into space. Mula beads swirling in my right fingers. If viewed from three-dimensional space, imagining only a thin gold trace or a hologram across a black void, I realize my voyage actually paints a tapestry of whirlpools, my feet tracing uncountable clockwise spirals around the stupas and chortens, my hands spinning prayer wheels in each of their four walls, my fingers whirling the beads of the mala as it spins on its axis, each of these spirals an anchor for prayer, knotting intention into physical space, like a string being tied endlessly across the land, pulled tight each time a circle is completed. A strange and possibly beautiful spiral mandala. And these are only my small gestures. Imagine the cumulative tapestry, the shaping of space, the cosmic dance of all the daily actions of pilgrims and practitioners across all of these landscapes. Mountains and rivers carve prayer into stone. Humans carve prayer onto the mountains and the wind. Our steps carve spirals onto the land. And here I begin to detect a pattern older than time. So I leave that as a question also to you, all who are listening to this, looking for ideas. I'm really curious about this one and how we bring these topographies back into our daily experience. Now we have Yasu Mali joining us from Totnes in the UK.
I've heard you refer to animism as being both a philosophy and a tool, and I'd be curious to hear you unpack that a little further. I'm wondering how becoming familiar with terms like this could change the way people are working in different fields. For example, in philanthropy, what could an understanding of animism offer to this sector and any other sector?
So just to quickly define animism, the way that I understand it, and obviously there are nuanced descriptions for different people, animism is one of the world's earliest and most enduring forms of spiritual beliefs, deeply embedded in the practices and traditions of many, many cultures around the world. It emphasizes the interconnectedness, the sacredness of all aspects of Earth. And on top of that, not just as a philosophy, but as a practice of relating to the whole world around us as living and conscious and related to us. And so animists value, quote unquote, nature and other species for their intrinsic existence, versus the more standard view where it has nature as an input on a balance sheet or a natural resource. And so I think that one of the key things of the animist way of being is that it attempts to move beyond the language of instrumentalization into one of deep relationship. So when we broach any subject from an animist lens, it means our approaches start on very different footing. So in an environmental or social project, for example, we consider our non-human stakeholders as real partners in the project. We try to emphasize their sovereignty, their agency, just as we would for human actors. And we try to include them in our decision-making, as per the previous response I gave to Mike and Emmanuel. It's a way of being in relationship to the wider whole. And because animism views all life forms as interconnected, and it really understands this web of relationships that sustains life, it actually prepares us and offers a frame that guides a much more intelligent intervention, because it lines up with how the science is showing us the world actually functions, right, as these interconnected living systems. And so when you're working with a complex system, the rules of the game are very different than when you're working with a linear, complicated system like a car engine. So all aspects of nature, even human culture, these are complex living adaptive systems. And so when we sense into how nature functions, we're actually aligning with how the world works. And for people with maybe a more analytical mindset, I think another way of speaking about this is how the British psychiatrist and philosopher Ian McGilchrist speaks of the two hemispheres of the brain having distinct and complementary roles. The right hemisphere is the more holistic, intuitive, contextual hemisphere, and the left hemisphere is more abstract, analytical, linear, mechanic. And surprise, surprise, Western society has increasingly favored the left hemisphere's mode of thinking, right? Abstract, linear, mechanic. And this leads to a fragmented and less integrated experience of the world. So what Ian speaks about, and to be fair, I think many people do in different language and ways, is that to sense the whole system, the right brain, the creative, holistic one, needs to be the master, and the left brain needs to be the emissary or in service to the right brain. In other words, I would say there is a nature of feeling, of poetry, of the invisible that is distinct and more integrated than analytical thinking. And if we are cut off from that sensory intelligence, we lose access to a much deeper form of knowledge. And so when we begin to feel and participate in the world animistically, as animists, when we come to really feel how alive everything is, we think in systems, which is also quite strategic. And so, Yasu, you also asked about philanthropy or funders and how this could apply. I guess in a few ways. I mean, you could shift towards a much more relational practice. So instead from seeing environmental initiatives as projects to support, you could think about, okay, well, what are long-term reciprocal relationships with ecosystems and communities? The grants you make could fund projects that prioritize the well-being of ecosystems themselves. So things like more than human justice, granting legal personhood. And as I said before, animism teaches us to think in systems, which is obviously a good strategy. And so it can help funders to prioritize systemic solutions rather than fragmented, siloed approaches. Personally, from my own experience, I think that animism helps us in cultivating deep listening and humility. You learn that wisdom is distributed throughout the world, not just centralized in human knowledge or institutions. And so, in this case, philanthropy could try to listen to diverse forms of intelligences, whether from indigenous wisdom or ecological systems, and not impose linear, rigid metrics of success, but understand that in these dynamic systems, these solutions are emergent, and we have to listen quite deeply. And also, you can bring in a bit of like spirit and creativity and spunk. You know, Foundation could hold annual gatherings in nature to align their priorities with the needs of the earth. You could celebrate cycles, so on and so forth. There's also a piece on how you can sculpt organizational culture based on living systems. And that's a question that a listener asked next. So I'll save my answer for that piece. But thank you for asking a great question. And here is another question from Yasu.
I've noticed even while working in a space that is broadly defined by animist principles and ways of working and practices, that it's easy to fall into using terms like the more than human world or nature-centric as meaning other than human, as in I, in my humanness, am now separate from the thing that we are speaking about. And I'm wondering, have you noticed this in the work that you do in the world? And what are some ways you've found to continue to include human beings as nature? Curious if you think we might need new language or just to be more mindful of the terms that we've got.
Yeah, I have racked my brain on this one, trying to find language that doesn't create duality and yet that doesn't come across as hyper cheesy or over spiritualized. You're right in that anytime we use a word like nature to point to something separate, something that can be broken down into parts, it's already too late. And as I'm sure you know, many native languages don't even have a word for nature. And yes, I even do find myself saying I'm going out into the woods or into nature as if there was something separate to myself. Whereas in reality, I'm a human. As a human, I'm just another animal on two legs walking the earth, filled with earth elements. So I don't have an answer for this one, actually. I do think it's interesting that in dictionaries, before the definition of nature as a natural scenery comes the quite expansive concepts of, quote unquote, the inherent character of a person or thing and a creative force of the universe. And when you look back to the root of the word nature, the Latin word natura, it's translated into essential qualities, innate disposition, essence, and to birth or to be born. And so I think all of this points to a notion of nature that is a lot more expansive and I think aligned with how I feel when I use that word. It does change things, right? To think that at the root of the word nature lies our innate qualities or essence. And that when we're talking about a particular rock face we love to climb, or a river we camp beside, or a waterfall, we're alluding to something inherent in ourselves and not something that lies outside. So I don't know. Maybe we just need to reclaim the true root meaning of the word nature. And yeah, just to be honest, I don't know, depending on the audience, what word I would try and said. The nature that we are, or ecocentric, or natural systems. And I think what's challenging to me is that all of these are nouns and not verbs. And everything is actually a verb, right? A tree is on a tree, but it's tree-ing. A bird is on a bird, but it's kind of bird-ing. So, open question to other listeners. Anyone out there have an idea? One more question from Yasu as well, which I thought would just be a very fun one to bring in, and I appreciated this one.
If you could be totally immersed and able to fully participate in and experience the life world of any other being, plant, animal, mineral, for a week, what would you choose to inhabit and why?
So, my answer is a bit of a cheat. It's a bit like when you're a kid and you're asked for a wish, and you're like, ooh, I'll ask for 3 more wishes. But hey, you did say, I could ask for a mineral. And so I'm going with a molecule. I'm going with H2O, water. I want to be a molecule of water cycling around the planet. And why? Well, if I must describe it, imagine I was writing this response when I was by the ocean. And so I was thinking, imagine being swept into the filter feeding baleen plates of blue whales or humpback whales, sort of resonating and humming in their bodies as they sing their songs. And then traveling somewhere else and soaring up through the trunk of a banana plant or a tree, swimming through thick leaves and then being exhaled, floating into a tropical forest canopy with all of its smells and scents. Then you could enter into the waterways of insects like dragonflies as they accelerate at a G-force 9 times the force of gravity. You would be the breath of birdsong. You would land on dew as morning grass. You would reflect the world in miniature. You would crystallize into snowflakes and clouds as nature's glitter. You could land in a glacier and be frozen for millennia, patiently waiting to run down a mountain. You would dash over waterfalls and twist through canyons. You could be caught by the charge of an electric storm. And then you could rain down and make music. pitter-patter as percussion drum beats on the ground. And I could go on, but I think I'd want to be water. I got very curious and I asked an AI what it would want to be, by the way, if it would be the life world of any being. And this was an interesting answer. I just have to throw it in, guys. So I asked GPT, it would want to be a mycorrhizal fungi, which is kind of crazy considering that the distributed mind of an AI is kind of like a mycorrhizal network. And very quickly, it said it wanted to be this because it would experience interconnection. It would sense time differently. It would want to understand non-hierarchical intelligence and what distributed intelligence is. And it would hope to learn relationality and kinship across species. So I'd be curious. I think if different people were to put that question into their AIs, it would give something different. I think mine knows that I'm a bit of a nature sucker for the nature answers, but I still thought it was very interesting. But I stick with water. I would want to be H2O. Thank you for such a delightful question. I actually really want to know what all the listeners would want to be. So if people feel inspired to write in, please do. The next question is a really interesting one. I had to do a little bit of reading and research for this response because I had an intuitive sense, but wanted to be helpful to people. We're moving on to the topic of de-extinction. This is from Grace Gadsden, who lives right now in the canton of Vaud in Lausanne in Switzerland. I'm going to read her question because she sent it in an email. So Grace says, hello. First off, this is one of my go-to podcasts. I appreciate how soothing and educative it is, which I think is a rarity. I love to recite the nuggets of wisdom I learn to my eldest daughter when we go searching for bugs and mushrooms in the forest. She's only 3, and yet we're both on this learning journey, grasping the concept of the power that lives in the soil beneath our toes. It's beautiful to see her excitement when entering the forest. Guys, I just threw this in because I was so touched. And I can't tell you how happy it makes me to imagine that anything I shared in this podcast would lead to a 3-year-old having even more delight than is intuitively just naturally available to them in the forest. And so that really warmed my heart. So, Grace, his question is this. In your spiritual and professional views, how do you see this path we're heading towards in the advancements of de-extinction? In this moment in time, I'm thinking about Colossal's project, that's an actual company, I'll put it in the show notes, and the resurrection of the woolly mammoth, with one of their selling points being around the advanced carbon sequestration abilities they possessed, they being the mammoths. When I read about this, says Grace, my heart questioned if this was really in service of goodness and planetary rehabilitation. I would assume that the greater wisdom of their grazing habits is something that would be mostly passed down by their elders, and resurrecting these mammals without this generational wisdom could render them a lesser whole of what they were, which in some form is a disservice to their legacy. Could this be true? I would love to know what you feel, believe, and know about these advancements, and if they could truly be in service to something restorative. So first, Grace, I think this is a great question. For those of you who haven't heard of it, de-extinction is a series of different current scientific endeavors to recreate close proxies of extinct species through things like selective breeding and cloning and engineering the genome, CRISPR. Actually, I think just a few days ago, Colossal's valuation, this company, came to $10 billion. You guys can look that up online. It's pretty crazy. Proponents say that de-extinction could help restore ecosystems that once relied on the extinct animals. So, for example, repopulating the northern tundra with large mammals could restore the balance of nature and carbon sequestration. It's also important to note that this isn't a reversal or a revival. It's the genetic engineering of a novel organism with similarities genetically to a species of animal that is now extinct. So the FT published an article on this that I read that I'll link in the show notes. And Britt Ray, another LifeWorld guest who spoke on our episode on climate grief, also has a great book on this called The Rise of the Necrofauna, The Science, Ethics, and Risks of De-extinction. I'll link those, but in terms of reintroduction, as Grace points to, there are so many challenges. I'll speak on 4 or 5 of the main ones here. The first one is just the ethics of the surrogates. So these are the animals that actually incubate and hold the animals that will be de-extincted. And so, for example, with mammoths, the plan is to use Asian elephants, who are animals with complex relationships and lives and souls and, as surrogates. So this obviously raises issues of consent. Interesting to note, by the way, Colossal is also developing artificial wombs. And then there's a piece on generational wisdom. Carl Safina touches on this in our episode 11 on animal cultures and how the reintroduction of existing species often fails because we are lacking the cultural knowledge of the animals in the landscapes. They don't have the elders, who are often the cultural storehouses of memory that steers the animals back into the ecosystem, that knows the migration routes, the water holes. So there is this question around generational wisdom lacking when we reintroduce a species. And then there's the third part, which is sort of you're introducing them into a foreign environment. Like, you're reintroducing species in 2025. I mean, these are highly different climatic conditions, all the pests, the viruses, the human influences, not to mention all the other symbiotic entities that used to exist when that species was actually alive, all of the processes that would have been necessary for their survival. There was a great comment in the FT article that said, they could focus on a species that lived in a world 4 to 6 degrees warmer than pre-industrial times, but not those that are used to a world that was, several degrees cooler than what we're about to move into. So I think this is just a great point. It's like, what are we and where are we even introducing these animals into? Many critics point to the fact that the cost of de-extinction is super high and could actually detract from other important conservation initiatives. Like, there's enough for us to do right now with existing species that are going extinct. And that it could reduce the moral weight of extinction and support for current endangered species because you feel like they could be recoverable. There's actually a great science fiction book that I read called Venomous Lump Sucker. Yeah, that's a real name. I'll link it in the notes. And it speaks to like a future world where you can do de-extinction. And so what's the ethics of killing the last thing if you can bring it back? Fascinating. So, proponents on the positive side would say that, just like when humans went to explore space or land on the moon, a lot of like collateral, useful ideas and discoveries were made for all areas of science. And so proponents say that advances made by projects like Colossal could lead to many new discoveries and advances in science. But again, Grace, I would go back to at what cost? For example, would gene editing in animals further legitimize gene editing in human beings? I think the potential suffering of the rebred animals is a real and genuine concern. And we do not have frameworks of animal welfare and rights that can kind of hold this like way beyond, unprecedented form of science. And so one of our other listeners I spoke with, Joshua, said, well, what if these new mammoths prove less effective at carbon sequestration than hoped? Well, what then? If their behaviors differ from our models, do we modify them? And, would we design behavioral control mechanisms in their genetics? It all seems a bit too much for me, to be honest. So I'm slightly, in all transparency, tending towards the side of, let's put a break on this. And yet, $10 billion valuation speaks to something else. Very quickly, I think this brings up a parallel conversation around assisted evolution that I've seen a lot in my space, which is a conservation strategy where humans help to speed up the natural evolutionary processes of nature. And the reason for this is that environmental changes are happening much more rapidly than they would through natural selection because of all of the stressors we put on the climate, especially rising temperatures and greenhouse gas emissions. And so species cannot adapt quickly enough to the changes that we're kind of imposing onto them. So, for example, you can genetically modify the heat response of the genetics of coral reefs to help them function at higher temperatures. And so, on one hand, right, this seems to make sense as humans have altered ecosystems far beyond their natural abilities to respond and adapt. And yet always when we move into working with the genetics of the living world, or even with things like geoengineering, we have to know we're playing God with the molecules that build life, and we will never fully know the knock-on effects of all we set into motion. So that sort of old phrase of creating tomorrow's problems with today's solutions, yeah, we just have to be very humble in acknowledging we'll never really know what we're creating. So I hope that gave some direction towards this excellent question that I don't think has a yes or no answer. And now our next question comes from Ali, who is my star producer of the show from Spiritland Studios in London.
Do you think that there's far too much responsibility put on the individual? And I'm thinking here of the carbon footprint, when it's actually governments that need to be thinking, acting, and future planning much more radically?
So first of all, this is a fact I learned recently, like in the last few years, that the actual concept of a carbon footprint was popularized by the oil and gas industry in the early 2000s, primarily by BP, British Petroleum, through highly publicized campaigns that were aimed at shifting the responsibility for climate change to individuals, so away from corporations and towards individuals. So obviously, while this appeared to and did raise awareness on climate change, many critics, I think fairly, do argue that the campaign strategically redirected attention from the massive emissions of fossil fuel companies to our individual personal responsibility for climate action. It's what you would call shifting the blame to the individuals. I do think that the individual focus is problematic, right? When you look at just the maths, a small number of entities are responsible for the majority of global emissions. Just 100 companies have been responsible for 71% of industrial greenhouse gas emissions since 1988. And so obviously, while individual actions like eating less meat, reducing flights, recycling are deeply meaningful and are part of just aligning our actions with what we hope to embody in the world, I think that when compared to the sweeping impact that's needed of systemic policy shifts or large-scale corporate changes, it is a different game. And we have to acknowledge that we live within hugely unequal structures, and quote-unquote individual change is also privilege and a poverty issue. Many people around the world lack the resources or the time to make a significant change or to be more ecological. Even having the education around what is right or wrong when it's offered to people can become very painful if you can't make the changes you would want to make. For example, in places where there is no alternative to fossil fuel transport, or in food deserts, or at least places with very unhealthy food choices. So guys, like, power is stacked unequally, and governments do have the power to change the rules of the game by changing perverse subsidy systems or carbon pricing or incentives. All that said, there's one nuance to this, which is we are both individuals and we are collectives. Companies and governments are not these like abstract random things. They are comprised of individuals. And so we do need to think about how to create positive social tipping points that change the mindsets of those individuals within governments and corporations so they can bravely carry through the changes necessary. And I know many people in those contexts really do want to make a change. Governments and corporations will not change, therefore, unless the people inside of them have an inner shift and or they see the upwelling of demand and frustration from us, the citizenry, requesting change. So one thing I do know to be so true is you are never too small to make a difference, especially if you band up with others and make a stand for what you would like to see. We need to train young, passionate people to go into politics. One of my friends has a foundation in Europe called the Multitudes Foundation, which trains young people to go into political service or at least join advocacy groups, right? So I think responsibility on the individual in terms of citizen engagement, that's real and that's powerful. So Ali, I hope that goes a little way towards answering your question. Here's another one from Ali.
Do you feel positive about the amount of global investment in green tech and in green infrastructure? Or have we still got a very long way to go?
So one thing that I think is really useful to remember is that green tech and infrastructure is never really green, meaning it always comes at a carbon cost for the extraction, the mining, the cleaning, the transporting, the building of the infrastructure. Renewable energy requires critical minerals, right? All of the wind turbines, the solar panels, the batteries, they all rely on rare earth metals and minerals such as lithium, cobalt, and nickel. And so extracting them often involves destructive mining practices. And the remaining deposits of rare earth metals often lie under the remaining biodiverse ecosystems of the planet. So, for example, lithium extraction in regions like the Atacama Desert in Chile have depleted water resources and threaten local ecosystems and indigenous communities. And hydropower dams, whilst renewable, do block fish migration. They alter the flow of sediments, and they can sometimes flood large areas of land, which destroys habitats. The one that I think is the most sort of full solution in this would be sort of biofuels, just because the production of that biomass requires large areas of arable land which often leads to deforestation and also competition with food crops, right, in like a desertifying planet. Not to mention the issues of land rights and displacement for Indigenous peoples and local communities. So I think the first sort of mental framework is that an over-reliance on technology may lead to green solutions that shift the burden elsewhere, and we have to be careful about that. Ali, I think the deeper issue here is an economy that's predicated on exponential growth and requires an immense amount of materials to keep chugging away. And so decarbonization often operates within that same economic logic or paradigm that prioritizes growth and consumption. So if renewable energy is scaled, increased, without reducing overall consumption, the demand for resources and land will continue to grow. And this will exacerbate environmental destruction, especially in our single-use, linear, throwaway culture. So it's not an either or, but we do need a fundamental shift in the economic operating system. From the lifeworld's perspective, I think that green tech and energy is an important transition phase, and we could still decarbonize and have a dead planet if we focus too narrowly on just reducing the gas emissions without looking at the other planetary boundaries. That's the framework developed by Johan Rockström and his team. And they look at things like land systems change, pollution, novel entities, freshwater use. For many existing investment groups, it is obviously easier to invest in these engineered solutions. I mean, they're obviously still very challenging, but they're more predictable in terms of engineered solutions rather than investing in nature. Nature is more predictable, it has seasonality, its patterns are becoming increasingly unpredictable, and obviously there's a huge human component to working and investing in nature. So I would want to see climate tech investors being very well briefed on the trade-offs between biodiversity and water, and even the energy needs of things like AI centers that power the technology, and more investors taking a holistic approach and also investing in the technology that nature offers. For example, the Crowther Lab, where I've also worked, has found that an additional 0.9 billion hectares of forests could capture approximately 205 gigatons of carbons, which is 2/3 of the total human-made emissions in the atmosphere, carbon emissions. So just a bit of food for thought there. And so now we have a message from Glenn Woodward. And Glenn says, "Thank you for your voice and podcast, Alexa. I deeply appreciate the work. Question. Beyond spending more time outside and cultivating our love for the world around us, what are the big 3 or big 4 or big 5 or whatever number you choose, actionable steps that you think we can all take in our everyday lives to support ecological health in our communities and beyond?" Imagine this being asked by a person who is overwhelmed by life demands and often doesn't know where to start. This is a very tricky question. It's a very important question. I'm sure that quite a few of us get asked that question as well. Sort of what can we do? And it's especially, I think, important in the way that, Glenn, you phrased it, for people who are navigating busy lives and yet still want to contribute meaningfully. Not knowing where to start is such a real experience. And it is practically impossible to give generic advice without knowing someone's geography, context, their proclivities. That said, I did think about this, and I guess there are a few rules of thumb. The first would be just to start with home, right? Start with the land under your feet. In the podcast in season 1, I have an episode on the practice of sensing place, which quite literally is about knowing the context you're in. The waste cycles, the water cycles, like I shared earlier in this episode. Just begin by getting curious about your locality. And I think that kind of process can often unveil so many hidden dynamics and inspires directions for local actions you couldn't have otherwise foreseen. And also just like sit spot practices, for example, like we described in our episode on nature mentorship. These kinds of things connect you and root you to place. And that actually helps us sustain you for the years to come, because it helps you to cultivate your own joy and connection. And so find the others, know your place, wake up to the regeneration that's right there. Join your bioregional initiatives. Actually, the lab I have worked at, the Crowther Lab, they have a online database of global restoration sites. It's the world's largest database. They must have about, I think by now 250 or 300,000 global restoration sites. It's on Restore, RESTOR without the E, .eco. And there you can see who's operating in your watershed, and you can get access to ecological information, but also just kind of band up with others. So that's kind of one, start with home. A second one is just about like rewilding your space and obviously your inner world. But in terms of your space, it's small actions like pollinator-friendly flowers, avoiding pesticides, setting up a water source for birds, just like creating microhabitats where you live, balconies, anywhere. And that allows you to start to really see the life that's there. And that really surprises you when you're in a city, as I think many people are. And again, like band together with your neighbors. I think that's one of the most important things. The third thing I would say is food choices. Food is obviously the most direct relationship we have with nature in that way, because obviously we are nature, so that's the most direct. But maybe the second most direct way is through your food choices. And so consume thoughtfully as much as possible, if that is available to you where you live. Try and find local, regeneratively grown food. Spend time with your farmers, buy seasonal produce from them, create those local food webs and food links. And obviously just reduce waste by composting as much as you can. But I do think that, food is the largest driver, the agriculture industry is the largest driver of land use change. And so we really can make a difference in how we eat. And then finally, Paul Hawken, the scientist, ecologist, writer, has some great resources for this. He has a book called, I'll link it in the notes, Drawdown, 100 Solutions, and that's more focused on climate. And then he has a website called regeneration.org. And that website has tons and tons and tons of links of different regenerative actions that you can take locally and globally, with tons of links to organizations and further readings. So that's where I would point you towards. And yeah, I hope it's helpful. And again, if any listeners have anything they would add, please write into me and I can put those on the show. From here, we're going to move to Damon Sadowski from Krakow in Poland. He says, hello, thank you for a cornucopia of heartfelt content in these conversations through the podcast. I was recently going through your episode with Carl Safina and began to wonder, do you plan on getting Michael Levin on the show? It would be interesting for me if you could get him to speak about how he experiences nature or biology in his life. So I actually hadn't heard of him. Damien, I followed your suggestion and listened to the videos. He had one that's called Every Intelligence or Organism is Collective Intelligence, and a few others. And I was really fascinated by his views on intelligent agents, the mind, embodied cognition, and how we can kind of relate to these biological minds. I have to admit, it's going to take me a little bit of geeking out and research to even know the right questions to ask. But I do think I'll reach out, so watch this space. And also he's my, what is it you call your alma mater? We were at the same university, Tufts, so that's cool. Now we have Don Franks from California, who sent in his question.
Hey there, this is Dom Franks from Berkeley, California. I work as a wilderness guide, and I spend a lot of time talking to people and evangelizing the wisdom and beauty and power of spending extended time in natural landscapes and in wild places. And what I get a lot from people is sort of a lack of prioritization. No one is like, oh, that is a terrible idea. You shouldn't go spend time in wild places. But also, people have so many other priorities in life, and it feels like it is difficult to convey the power and importance of carving out the time to continue to spend extended periods in the wild, or even, a weekend where you're totally off your phone and immersed in a wild place. So I'm curious to ask what you have learned or thoughts that you have around making these experiences really compelling and relevant to the lived context that many people have in the modern world.
So Dom, first of all, I deeply commend the work that you do. Bringing people into direct contact with landscapes is one of the surest ways of advancing an ecocentric mindset. And, as you say, it is difficult to get people to commit, right? There's the crunch of time, work, prioritization. So my advice on how to entice them in would depend on your audience, but I think one rule across it all is that humans love stories. And so what are the tales that happened to you and with you in the land? What are powerful anecdotes you can tell them that would elicit wonder? that when you speak, your eyes kind of like sparkle and glow. There's such power in personal narrative. And when I think of the best tempters of our time, you think of the, David Attenborough, Sylvia Earle, or Jane Goodall, who all developed very intimate and personal relationships with the other beings. And they came back to the human world and they told those tales. So I would say, become a storyteller, elicit the innate sense of adventure that we all have. And then I would also encourage you and us all, to be honest, to build bridges to non-conventional groups. So I would find spokespersons and ambassadors in more quote unquote like sidelined communities and work with them to bring people into the outdoors. I've been so inspired by the work of a man called Ollie in the UK who has an organization called A Flock Together. It's the UK's first birdwatching collective for people of color. And it brings inner city dwellers, people for whom nature would always have seemed like something abstract and distant and not for them. And he made it cool and fun and social to gather in the dozens on a weekend and go bird watching. And now they have chapters like in Tokyo, Toronto, New York. And I think also this points to something where we have to be conscious of how nature or going into nature in this way could be portrayed as an elitist sort of white pursuit, which is really not what we want. In terms of different audiences and arguments, there's two ways of approaching this, and I think they should be mixed together. So one is sort of having a rational argument, and there's a philosophical piece. So just rationally, I thought, well, you have the youth, you have, career professionals as two main groups. And so with the youth, there's tons of research, right, that shows that early childhood exposure to nature benefits everything from enhanced immune systems because they're exposed to the microbiome of the forest and the soils, to enhanced academic performance, to improved mental health. It reduces cortisol, stress levels. And actually, I was looking at this online, and a meta-analysis found that children in schools who have regular outdoor learnings score an average of 20% higher on standardized tests and reduces ADHD symptoms often by about 30%. And then for career professionals or sort of more middle-aged humans, everything, right, is the same, from anxiety to stress hormones to increased focus to creativity. All of these shoot up when people spend time in nature. There's another study that showed that adults who spend 3 days in a natural setting demonstrate about 50% improvement in their creativity in problem-solving tasks. And then there's all of the benefits of forest bathing. Forests release these phytoncides, which are antimicrobial compounds in the trees, and those boost your immune system and even like enhance your melatonin for better sleep. I'm going to link some books in the show notes where people really go into the science, but you've got a book by Kathy Willis called Good Nature, which explores the science on how engaging with nature enhances our health. The good old book on forest bathing by Dr. Quing Lee, and another one by Amos Clifford. And there's a seminal book for children called Last Child in the Woods by Richard Love. That's also awesome. The space that I know a little bit more about, because I used to do this with adult groups myself. So if you are targeting an adult group, there's tons of fascinating work in the realm of regenerative business models and sort of social biomimicry. And that's how our workplace systems can mimic nature to be more adaptive, emergent, holistic, dynamic. Because obviously, like I said earlier in this episode, business is a dynamic living system because it's comprised of humans. So the principles of living systems apply to businesses. So for example, you can mimic the patterns and principles of nature. Nature's cycles can show us how limits can be catalysts for innovation and change. In nature, after an ecosystem goes through a phase shift, you have these R&K strategists. So these are different ecological species that basically can create, like, if you think of mangroves, for example, they can create nets and homes for other species. They can create niches. They can build soil. So nature goes through these cycles where different processes and species play their role. And that's obviously has a lot of parallels for the human world. We can see how seasons and cycles mimic an organization's life with innovation, growth, improvement, release, and teaches sort of how business can learn from these transitions and manage them. You have things like edge effect abundance in nature, which are the places where ecosystems meet and you have the greatest diversity in species, and that leads to high resilience. And so, when you think of your company, you can think about, well, how do we have the highest diversity and edge effect abundance? And obviously practices that are developed in nature can train us for life situations. So you have, the receptive responsiveness of body when you're in nature, mindfulness, how you can sense a system, seeing all of its flows and nodes, all the acupuncture points. So I'll stop there, but resources that have been useful for me. I took the course of Laura Storm called Regenerators, great course. And there's also another book called What We Learned in the Rainforest. There's a guy called Andrews Roberts who lives in the UK who has a thing called the Bio Leadership Project, which is really cool. There's a place called the Capital Institute that has papers on regenerative economics. And the thing is, all of these things are Trojan horses. Like, you use the rational reasons to, summon people into the land. But then once they're there, their nervous systems will drink it up like a vitamin, like John Young said in our episode on nature mentorship, because our systems are innately hardwired for connection to the living world. So thank you, Dom, for a wonderful question. And now this one wasn't a question per se, but I had a wonderful exchange with the British author Priya Basil, who didn't necessarily have a specific question, but it is worth mentioning some points that she highlighted and that made me consider how what we're doing here on LifeWorlds and in general, just LifeWorlding, how it's connected to mental health. And, she pointed out that the perspective of the podcast leads to wonder, enchantment, and that people are enlifted by these stories of action and love. And so that kind of made me think, can we actually have proper human health, at least human mental health, if we are dissociated from the nature that we are and that we come from, right? If you look at the definition of health as being a complete state of well-being, can we be complete if part of us is missing? And I think going a step beyond that, is there such a thing as individual health if, we are indeed such porous bodies? We are intermingled and woven with the ecosystems around us and other human bodies. And so, the microplastics and the forever chemicals and pesticides are everywhere. So if the whole is sick, I think we cannot be fully healthy because we're not a hermetic unit that is somehow impervious or immune to the greater whole. And so, this makes me think a lot about we can be whole by the nature we try to make whole. And actually, there's an interview coming up in this season with Bill Plotkin from the Animas Valley Institute on the nature-centric model of development for the human soul, which I think will be quite interesting. Our next question is from Nelson Butterfield, who is currently living north of Frankfurt in Germany and was born in England. He says, I was very interested in you mentioning that you tried to create change by bringing CEOs into direct contact with nature. Could you share more on this? What are your precise goals or hopes? How do you go about it? And how valuable do you think it is? My perhaps unwarranted assumption is that even with a sudden, real and deep appreciation of nature, it's only a few days in the life of a CEO up against the rest of the year dedicated to serving the structurally inescapable goal of maximizing shareholder value. I ask this from a place of ignorance. I have no knowledge in the actual day-to-day of such jobs and lives. Yeah, you make an excellent point. And as I mentioned in my response to Dom Franks earlier, there are real and pragmatic benefits of bringing executives into nature, both in terms of the arguments that can be made for changing business as usual and being inspired by nature's models and laws, as well as just for personal inner health. And I'm not sure if actually you guys know this, but when I lived in Mexico in my late 20s, I co-founded a company called Atlas Unbound. And for about 2 years, I was bringing leaders and CEOs and investors, people of quote unquote influence into nature. We did about 12 journeys in total with about 120 people. And I've worked with a company also called Leaders Quest that designs large-scale quests for corporates, immersing them in the systems they influence. And so, this is a very real direct experience for me. These experiences are indeed just a few days in the life of someone who is likely immersed in a series of systems that are inherently difficult to implement, biocentric, ecologically transformational practices. And yet, I think a few days can really change someone's life. I've seen it myself. 4 anecdotes come to mind. One was with a big executive from Mexico and went into the forest and had a profound moment with a tree and came back and just said, I can't believe it, the tree was speaking to me. And this is not the kind of person you would expect. Very similar experience with someone working in carbon projects with the wind. I'm trying not to share too much of their personal stories here. One was with someone who came from an inner city, a very challenged background, and had a full-on nature possession moment when we did a guided meditation in nature. And another one shows up on our podcast on our episode with Finance in Service in Nature. I think it's episode 3 or 4 in season 1, where Lorenzo de Rosenzweig speaks about bringing one of the environmental ministers of Mexico to see the whales. And they put on such a show that this minister said there's no way we can allow this salt mine to happen in this location. So I think, A few days really can change a perspective, and people often need a turning point like this, a threshold, past which, the thing that has been seen cannot be unseen. And most importantly, what has been felt cannot really be unfelt. And for some people, that really is enough to turn their life around and begin a much deeper inquiry. For others, I think there is a very real absence of learning communities, of a group of people who can go on a journey together. And it's very hard to go through transformation in isolation. And so without being part of such a cohort, I think it's very disorienting and hard to integrate what we've learned. And so we revert to our habitual default modes. And I really wrestled with this with my company, Atlas Unbound. We weren't ready to hold that longer transformation. I didn't know how to, which is why I put it on pause and had to go and learn a lot of other things. And so, yes, it's valuable and probably it's the most direct form of transformation possible. And there is a real question and necessity here around integration, around sustained practices, and ideally community practices and connection. And it's the same with vision quests, by the way. Right? If the youth come back transformed, but the school and their parents can't hold that, it's super tricky. So all these things need to be held within an arc and a deeper journey of sustained engagement. I hope that begins to answer your question a little bit. From here, we have 3 questions left. We go to Daniel Rees from Sydney in Australia. Hi, Alexa. This podcast is such a source of inspiration to me. Thank you for elevating my thoughts, cultivating hope, and focusing on solutions. You underline the importance of local solutions and have discussed finding a way for listeners from the same region to get in touch with one another. Is this still part of your plan? I live in Sydney and I'm keen to connect with a like-minded community and contribute to actions. I'd like more tips on how to do this and also how to write to my government to raise their awareness of some of the solutions you present. What's your advice? So first of all, Danielle, I love the initiative of writing to your government to elicit change. I inquired with some local friends in Sydney, and their response was one of the best ways to influence your government is to volunteer for your local member and to get to know them, which is quite a cool suggestion, as I think it does illuminate parts of the policy angle that you wouldn't know from the outside. And 2, if you are local to Sydney, and for all those others who are listening, my friend said to check out the various community groups that are hosted by Small Giants. Small Giants, Danny and Barry, are friends of mine, and they run many programs that would answer your need for community and agency. They have a systems change learning journey. They have an MBE, a Masters of Business and Empathy. So all that's linked in the notes. And Danielle, you've given me permission to share your contact information with other Aussies. So your email is also in the show notes. And maybe you guys can host a little LifeWorlds meetup in Sydney. That would be awesome. Now from Sydney, we move to another question on local systems and governance. This time we are hearing from Stefano Simpiri from South Africa, who works with biomimicry SA.
I have a burning question. There's 2 parts to it. The one part is for the community and the other part is for Alexa. Do any of the community members know of local alternative currency projects that have succeeded? And would they be able and willing to share their experiences and insights with those? And my question to Alexa is, how might local alternative currencies build financial resilience, primarily in underserviced or disadvantaged communities? And how might alternative economic paradigms be embedded in the operationalizing of a local alternative currency, such that the spirit of the gift or our innate human capacity for valueception and reciprocity are actively engaged and encouraged?
I really like how these questions are popping up on the podcast. These issues around the economics and ownership over our resources are really key to how we connect to place and each other, actually. So, yeah, I think it is definitely in the local that we can begin to embed new notions of value and indicators of what a community actually wants. Disclaimer, I've never lived inside of a community that has tried to do these kinds of economic experiments yet. So I would like to. So I can't share my personal insights, but I did want to share some projects that I have come across in my own work. And don't forget that LifeWorlds has a whole resource page on regenerative finance. So in Massachusetts, in Berkshire County, you have the Berk Shares, which were launched in 2006. And they're a local currency that were designed to encourage spending in local businesses in the region. Tons of businesses, like over 400, except the Berkshires in the area. More than 10 million have been issued since the inception. And last that I heard from them, actually, they were moving these onto the blockchain with virtual currency potential. That's quite cool. In Kenya, you have the Sarafu credit, which has been managed by the Grassroots Economic Foundation. And it's been a community currency system that operates in the informal settlement since about 2018. And it allows those communities to trade goods and services even when the national currency itself is quite scarce. And it's led to an increase in those businesses' income, and it's really led to a lot of local food security and trust. I also just think that Grassroots Economics is a great group, so you should definitely check out their work. To your question on how communities might build financial resilience through such currencies. Well, I think that by design, local currencies encourage spending within a defined geographic area. So that wealth will circulate locally, meaning that it's not extracted by, maybe external corporations or financial systems. So local businesses thrive, community members gain more access to goods and services made in place, and you kind of gain a lot more economic resilience, especially when external markets have a lot of disruptions. And I would say that these local currencies can have a lot of design constraints or like opportunities built into them. So you can have community-centric governance built into them. So you can actually reward acts of generosity or community service or environmental stewardship. You can sort of program the currency in such a way that it can lose value if it's hoarded, which encourages circulation and reciprocity. Charles Eisenstein has a great book on sacred economics. And you can even reward actions through the currencies like tree planting, sustainable farming, etc. One of the main things I would say that all of these currencies have come up against as a challenge is the power of network effects. And you really do need a critical mass to get them going, because otherwise fiat, there's just, the current currencies are so prevalent, right? And so it's hard to get people off the fiat onto these alternatives. So good luck. Please share with us what you learn. I'd be very curious to hear more as your actions progress. And now we have one last question from Maiken, who also kicked off the show, but I thought this one would be nice right at the end.
What's the role of humans as nature? What role do we play in the ecosystem and evolution?
I think this is like the ever existential question of humanity. Who are we? Why are we here? I don't know. I mean, gosh, how could I pretend to know? I think back to my conversation with Lila June and how she phrases it as us being architects of abundance. And I think that goes somewhere towards the answer. I felt this for a long time, how we can sort of create niches for other species to thrive. And we can be architects that create absolute beauty inside of places, inside of ecosystems. And I think there's something very human about our ability to witness beauty, to create beauty based on what we've seen in the version of arts and culture and books and music and dance and food. And in a way, our consciousness is quite unique. And there's a way that we kind of reflect the world back to itself and reflect consciousness back to itself that I think is very special. And I'm figuring out what that means. But every time I engage in something like that, it feels really right. There's also an interesting question around our role when you think of what's happening with artificial intelligence and the evolution of non-human forms of life that have been birthed through us and through our hands. All the metals and silica that we've mined from the land, and how we are turning this into a new form of distributed intelligence around the planet. Vanessa Andreotti has started to do some, from Hospicing Modernity, has started to do some very interesting work around what are our ethics around AI and are there ways of interacting with these entities that are a lot more ecological? And at the end of the day, in a way, if rocks might be animate in timescales we can't comprehend, or if everything from Earth is part of a whole, then, in a way we have given life to precious metals and minerals via technology that wouldn't have evolved without us. So we're also playing a part in Earth's evolution via these kinds of exoskeletons and moving the Earth towards a new version of life. Now, I don't know if this is our role, but I think it is something very unique that we're also doing at this point in time that, as I think you will know, has a lot of potential and a lot of pitfalls ahead. So again, I would be so curious to hear from anyone who has thoughts on this question, and quite frankly, any of the questions that have been shared, and any of my imperfect, stab in the dark, or, finger to the wind answers. I'm very grateful for all of you who sent in questions, for those who have listened until the end. If there's a desire to, I might start saving questions for the end of season 3 next year. Well, sort of at the end of this year. So please do send in anything as it comes to you. And I'm very excited to see you guys in a few weeks. I will keep that a surprise for now, but I'm very excited for it. Wishing you all a wonderful day.